You know, they tell you about the empty nest. They prepare you for it in magazine articles and in quiet, knowing smiles from other women at the grocery store. Oh, just wait, they'd say, once the kids are gone, the silence will be deafening. They'd talk about the lost little socks under the bed, the ghost of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the air, the strange, hollow echo in the hallway where teenage laughter used to bounce off the walls. They prepare you for the quiet. What they don't prepare you for is the noise. Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Not the good noise, the happy chaos of a family, but the terrible grinding noise of silence being broken by the sound of your own heart cracking right down the middle. My name is Ruth, and I'm 53 years old. This story, it doesn't start with a bang, not with a dramatic explosion or a secret revealed in a dusty attic. It started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in October. The light was that particular kind of golden that only autumn can manage, slanting through the big kitchen window and catching the dust motes dancing over the sink. I was wiping down the counters, the smell of lemon-scented cleaner mixing with the lingering aroma of the meatloaf I'd made for dinner. My meatloaf. The one with the brown sugar and ketchup glaze that Michael and Chloe had always fought over when they were small. That was the thought in my head, you see, a sweet, sentimental thought. How my now 30-year-old son Michael used to sneak bits of the crispy topping when he thought I wasn't looking. How Chloe, 27 and so fiercely independent, would always insist on having the end piece, the one with the most glaze. I was smiling to myself, lost in the warmth of those memories, when the sound of the front door opening and closing, too heavy for just my husband, Paul, pulled me back. "Mom, you in here?" It was Michael's voice, but it had a tone to it, a clipped, businesslike quality that didn't belong in my warm, golden kitchen. I turned, the dishcloth still in my hand, and saw him standing in the doorway. My boy. He had his father's build, tall and solid, but he had my father's eyes, a deep, soulful brown. Except today, they didn't look soulful. They looked assessing. He was followed by Chloe, who was tapping away on her phone, her brow furrowed in that familiar, impatient way. "Of course I'm here," I said, my smile feeling a little stiffer now. "What brings you two by? There's leftover meatloaf." Chloe didn't look up from her phone. "We ate, Mom. We need to talk," Michael said, pulling out a chair from the kitchen table. It scraped against the tile floor, a sound that set my teeth on edge. "Is Dad home?" "He's in the study, paying bills," I said, a cold little knot beginning to form in my stomach. "Is everything all right, the kids?" They didn't have children yet, but the question was automatic. A mother's first fear. "The kids are fine," Chloe said, finally slipping her phone into her designer handbag. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes scanning the slightly worn cabinets, the old but serviceable appliances, and I felt, for the first time, a flicker of, what, shame? This was my home. I'd raised them here. But under her gaze it suddenly felt dated. Shabby. Michael gestured for me to sit. "Come on, Mom. This is important." So I pulled out the chair opposite him and lowered myself into it, the dishcloth a damp, crumpled ball in my lap. I felt like a child about to be scolded. Paul chose that moment to come in, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, a stack of envelopes in his hand. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice genial, unaware of the tension that had sucked all the warmth out of the room. "We're just having a family meeting," Michael said, as if we did this all the time. We didn't. Our family meetings used to be about vacation plans or setting rules for curfews. Once Paul was seated, Michael leaned forward, his elbows on the old oak table. "Mom, Dad, we've been talking, Chloe and I. And we're worried about you." Paul and I exchanged a glance. "Worried?" Paul echoed. "What in the world about?" "We're fine," My blood pressure is down. Your mother's arthritis is manageable. It's not about your health. Chloe cut in, her voice sharp. It's about all of this. She made a vague, dismissive gesture that seemed to encompass the entire house, our entire life. This house is too big for you two. The upkeep must be a nightmare. And financially, well, let's be honest. Dad's pension, and what Mom makes from her part-time bookkeeping, it's not exactly a growth strategy. I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. A growth strategy. I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. This is our home, Chloe. Not a stock portfolio. That's the problem, Mom, Michael said, his voice taking on that patient, explaining things to a child tone that I would come to despise. You're too sentimental. You're not thinking practically. This house is your biggest asset. It's sitting here, full of memories and old furniture, when it could be working for you. For us. For the future. The future? Paul said, his geniality finally giving way to confusion. What are you talking about, son? And then it began to spill out. The plan. It was so rehearsed, so coldly logical. They talked about reverse mortgages, about downsizing, about equity and leveraging assets. They used words that felt like stones being thrown at us. They painted a picture of our later years as a precarious, frightening time, a cliff we were teetering on the edge of, and they were the only ones who could pull us back. We're thinking of your best interests, Chloe said, and for a moment her voice softened, almost convincing. We don't want you to struggle. We want to help you manage things. It's what family does. The knot in my stomach tightened. This didn't feel like help. It felt like a takeover. I looked at their faces, these two beautiful people I had carried and nursed and read to and worried over for 3 decades. I saw the determination in Michael's jaw, the impatient gleam in Chloe's eye. And I saw something else. Something I couldn't quite name then, but I can now. It was entitlement. A deep, unshakable belief that what was ours was, by extension, theirs. Not through love or legacy, but by right. The conversation, if you could call it that, went on for another hour. They laid out spreadsheets on their tablets, showing us projected property values and cost of living increases. They talked about a transition into a nice, manageable apartment. They never once asked us what we wanted. They never once looked at the history in these walls, the pencil marks on the doorframe charting their growth. The faint stain on the living room carpet from when Michael spilled grape juice during his 6th birthday party. The backyard where Paul had painstakingly built them a treehouse. When they finally left, with promises to circle back after we'd had time to process, the silence they left behind was worse than any empty nest silence I had ever imagined. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with betrayal. Paul was the first to speak. He let out a long, weary sigh and rubbed his face with his hands. Well, he said, his voice rough. That was something. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the door they had just walked out of. My mind was racing, replaying every word, every glance. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening settling outside. Later that night, after Paul had gone to bed, too defeated to even watch his usual shows, I found myself wandering through the house. I wasn't just seeing the worn spots on the rug or the outdated wallpaper in the hall. I was seeing my life. I ran my hand over the back of the sofa where I'd rocked a feverish Chloe all night long. I stood in the doorway of Michael's old room, now a guest room, and I could still see the glow in the dark stars he'd stuck to the ceiling. This was more than a house. It was the container for all my love, all my labor. It was the one thing I had truly built. And my children, my own children, had just looked at it and seen a problem to be solved. An asset to be liquidated. I ended up in the kitchen again, drawn to the phone on the wall. My finger, almost of its own volition, dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a warm, familiar voice answered. Ruthie, is that you, honey? It's late? Everything all right? It was my Auntie Grace, my mother's sister. She was 78 years old, and her voice was like a soft, well-loved quilt. Hearing her concern, the dam inside me broke. A sob I didn't even know I was holding back choked its way out. "Auntie Grace," I managed, my voice trembling. Michael and Chloe, they came over tonight." "Oh, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear her settling into her chair, the receiver cradled close. Tell Auntie Grace everything." And so, standing there in the dark kitchen, with only the moonlight streaming in, I did. I poured it all out: the spreadsheets, the cold analysis of our lives, the utter lack of sentiment, the feeling of being assessed like a failing business. She listened without interrupting, making soft, comforting sounds. When I was finished, spent and hollow, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ruth, my dear child, you listen to me. A mother's heart is the strongest muscle in the world, but it's also the most easily bruised. What you're feeling, that's the bruise, but you need to pay attention to it." "This doesn't sound right. What should I do?" I whispered, feeling like a little girl. Again. "For now," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You sleep, you hold on to Paul, and you remember who you are. You are not just their mother. You are Ruth. You built this life once. Don't you ever forget that you have the strength to do it again, if you have to." I hung up the phone, her words echoing in the silence. "You built this life once." I looked around my kitchen, at the familiar, comforting shapes in the dark. The nest wasn't empty, it was under siege. And for the first time, a tiny, fragile spark of defiance ignited deep within me. It was a small thing, barely a flicker, but it was there. And in the long, cold months that were to come, I would learn to fan that spark into a flame that would save me. That spark of defiance Auntie Grace had kindled in me. It flickered bravely for a night, a small, warm ember, in the cold dread that had settled in my chest. But by the next morning, the practicalities of life had a way of smothering it. The sun rose, as it always does. Paul needed his coffee before heading to the hardware store for a part for the leaky faucet. I had a client's books to balance. The world kept turning, and the terrible conversation from the night before began to feel like a bad dream, something that couldn't possibly have happened in the sane, ordinary light of day. We moved around each other quietly that Wednesday morning, a careful dance of avoidance. Paul finally broke the silence as he was pulling on his jacket. "Don't let it upset you, Ruth," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "They're just kids, ambitious. They see the world differently than we do. They probably think they're helping." "Helping?" I said, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "Paul, they talked about our home like it was a piece of livestock that had outlived its usefulness." He sighed, a heavy, burdened sound. "I know, but it's Michael, it's Chloe, our kids. They love us." He said it with such desperate conviction, as if saying it out loud would make it true enough to paper over the cracks. He gave me a quick, awkward pat on the shoulder before heading out the door. That was Paul. A fixer by nature, a man who believed most problems could be solved with a wrench and a little patience. But this wasn't a leaky pipe. This was a fissure in the very foundation of our family. And he had no tool for that. I tried to lose myself in my work, in the clean, logical columns of debits and credits for a small local bakery. Numbers made sense. They added up, they told a clear, unambiguous story. Unlike the conversation with my children, which felt like a story written in a language I no longer understood. The phone rang around 10, startling me. My heart gave a little lurch, a conditioned response from years of it being a school nurse or one of the kids needing a ride. But the caller ID showed Michael's name. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "Michael, hello. Hi, Mom." His voice was different today, softer. The clipped, corporate tone was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like contrition. "Listen, about last night. Chloe and we've been talking. We feel terrible. We came on way too strong." The relief that washed over me was so immediate and so powerful it felt like a physical wave. See, I told myself. Paul was right. They're just kids. They got carried away with their big ideas. They didn't mean it. They love us. Oh, Michael, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It's okay. It was a lot to take in. I know, he said, and I could almost hear him shaking his head, the picture of a chastened son. We were just so wrapped up in this idea of securing your future, we forgot to be your kids. We forgot to be gentle. Can we make it up to you? Let me take you and Dad out for a proper dinner tonight. My treat. Somewhere nice. No spreadsheets, I promise. The invitation was like a balm. This was the Michael I knew. The one who, as a teenager, had used his first paycheck from his summer job to take me and Paul out for a fancy steak dinner, beaming with pride the whole time. This was the connection I was craving, the reassurance that we were still a family. That sounds wonderful, honey, I said, feeling the tight knot in my shoulders begin to loosen for the first time in nearly 24 hours. Great. I'll make a reservation for 7 at the Oak Room. I'll pick you guys up at 6:30. When Paul came home, I told him, my voice bright with manufactured optimism. See, they're sorry. Michael just called. He wants to take us to the Oak Room for dinner to apologize. Paul's face relaxed into a genuine smile. The Oak Room? That's my boy. Always had expensive taste. He seemed so pleased, so ready to accept this peace offering and move on. I wanted to be too. I desperately wanted to fold this back into the narrative of a happy family, a little bump in the road now smoothed over. That evening, I took care with my appearance. I put on the navy blue dress I saved for special occasions, the one Paul said brought out the blue in my eyes. I even put on a string of pearls, a gift from my own mother. I wanted to look like the mother Michael and Chloe remembered. The one who was in control, who was loved and respected. Michael arrived precisely at 6:30, looking handsome and successful in a crisp, button-down shirt. He was all charm, holding the car door open for me, asking Paul about the faucet, making easy, light conversation on the drive to the restaurant. It felt so normal, so right. The dread of the previous night receded, becoming a faint, bad memory. The Oak Room was everything its name implied. Dark, rich wood, soft lighting, the low hum of quiet conversation, and the clinking of fine glassware. It was a world away from my kitchen with the lemon-scented cleaner. Michael had reserved a secluded booth in the back. And there, waiting for us, was Chloe. She stood up as we approached, and she gave me a quick, airy hug. Mom, you look nice. She was wearing a chic black designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Her smile was bright, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Still, I chose to see what I wanted to see. I chose to see my daughter. We ordered. Michael insisted on a bottle of expensive wine. The conversation was stilted at first, a careful navigation around the elephant in the room. We talked about the weather, about a movie Paul and I had seen, about Michael's work in commercial real estate. Chloe talked about her interior design business, dropping names of affluent clients and trendy neighborhoods. It was over the main course, as we were all enjoying our food, that Michael carefully set down his fork and knife. The prelude was over. Mom, Dad, he began, his voice taking on that measured, sincere tone I now recognized as his serious business voice. There's a reason I wanted to bring you here tonight. To apologize, yes, absolutely. But also to properly explain what Chloe and I have been so concerned about. I felt my appetite begin to curdle. Paul took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes guarded. We were clumsy last night. Chloe chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet. We're just so worried. We see you working so hard, Dad with the house, Mom with her bookkeeping. At your age, you should be relaxing, enjoying life. Traveling. Traveling sounds expensive, Paul said, a rare, dry joke that fell flat. It doesn't have to be, Michael said, leaning forward. That's what we're trying to say. You have all this potential, this equity, just sitting in the house. But it's a liability, too. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Property taxes, insurance, repairs, it's a money pit. And when, one of you needs, well, long-term care. He let the grim phrase hang in the air between us. Medicaid will just take it. They'll take everything you've worked for. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They were using fear now. The fear of sickness, of poverty, of losing everything. They were painting a nightmare scenario and presenting themselves as the only solution. What are you suggesting, Michael? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He took a deep breath. We've done a lot of research, and we've spoken with a lawyer, a friend of mine, who specializes in estate planning. The safest, smartest thing for you to do is to sign the house over to Chloe and me. Now, the air went out of the room. I actually looked around, half expecting the other diners to be staring at us, to have heard the audacity of the proposition. But the soft conversations continued, oblivious. Sign over the house? Paul said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. To you? It's just a legal formality, Dad. Chloe said quickly, reaching out as if to pat his hand, but he moved it away. You would still live there. Of course you would. It would always be your home. This is just about asset protection. It puts the house out of reach of any future creditors or nursing homes. It ensures that the family wealth stays in the family. It's for our inheritance. There it was. The word I'd been waiting for, dreading. Inheritance. It wasn't about our well-being. It was about securing their future. They were afraid we'd spend their money. You want us to give you our home, I said slowly, ensuring I understood the sheer magnitude of it, so that you can be sure you'll get it. It's not like that, Mom, Michael said, his patience starting to wear thin. It's a strategic move. A lot of families do it. You'd be the beneficiaries of a trust we'd set up. You'd have a life estate. It's all perfectly legal and above board. A life estate? I repeated. The term sounded so sterile, so final. It sounded like a waiting room for death. It means you have the right to live there for the rest of your lives, Chloe explained, as if to a particularly slow child. It just means the ownership is transferred. For safekeeping. I looked at their faces, these two strangers who had my children's eyes and my children's smiles. They were so sure of themselves, so convinced of the righteousness of their plan. They had an answer for everything. A lawyer, a trust, a life estate. They had built a beautiful, logical cage for us, and they were gently, patiently, trying to lure us inside. Paul was shaking his head, his jaw set. No, absolutely not. This is my house. I paid the mortgage on it for 30 years with the sweat of my brow. My name is on the deed. It's staying there. Dad, be reasonable, Michael said, his voice hardening. This is the 21st century. You have to think ahead. You're being sentimental and stubborn. Stubborn? Paul's voice rose, drawing a few glances from a nearby table. He lowered it to a furious whisper. You come to us with a scheme to take our home, and I'm the one who's stubborn? It's not a scheme. Chloe hissed, her composure finally cracking. Why can't you see that we're trying to help you? Why are you being so difficult? Most parents would be grateful their children are so involved. The rest of the dinner was a ruin. The food, once delicious, turned to ash in my mouth. The expensive wine tasted like vinegar. The conversation died a painful death. Michael paid the check with a terse swipe of his credit card, and the car ride home was conducted in a silence so thick and hostile you could have cut it with a knife. When we pulled up to the house, our house, with its familiar, welcoming light on the porch, Michael didn't turn off the engine. He just looked straight ahead. Think about it, he said, his voice flat and cold. "It's the smart thing to do. Don't let your pride blind you to what's practical." We got lined out of the car without a word. We stood on the sidewalk and watched his taillights disappear around the corner. The chilly night air felt like a slap. Inside, Paul went straight to the kitchen and poured himself a whiskey, something he only did when he was truly shaken. He didn't speak. He just stood by the sink, staring out into the dark backyard, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. I went to the living room and sank onto the sofa, the same one I'd rocked Chloe on. I felt numb. The pretense was gone. The charm offensive was over. The velvet glove was off, revealing the iron fist beneath. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a campaign. I picked up the phone. This time, I didn't call Auntie Grace, I called her sister, my Auntie Clara. If Grace was the soft quilt, Clara was the stiff spine. She was 75, sharp as a tack, and suffered no fools. She answered on the first ring. "Ruth, what's wrong?" She never bothered with hello. The story tumbled out of me again, this time about the fancy dinner, the fear tactics, the cold, calculated proposition to sign over our home. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her mind working, sorting through the facts, discarding the emotion, getting to the hard, cold core of it. Finally she spoke, her voice like gravel. "Ruth, listen to me, and listen good. They're not trying to protect you, they're trying to possess you. They want to own the roof over your head because then, my dear, they own you. They can dictate your life. They can hold it over you. Do not, under any circumstances, sign a single piece of paper. Do you hear me? You sign that house over and you are no longer Ruth the mother. You are Ruth, the tenant. And trust me, they will be the kind of landlords you do not want." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the truth, stripped bare and ugly. She saw it with a clarity that Paul and I, in our love-blinded state, had refused to see. "What do I do, Auntie Clara?" My voice was small, a child's voice. "You stand your ground," she said, without a moment's hesitation. "You plant your feet on your own floorboards and you tell them no. It's a complete sentence. You don't owe them an explanation. You don't owe them your home. You built it. You defend it." I hung up the phone, her words echoing Clara's stern advice mixing with Grace's comforting wisdom in my head. The spark of defiance was back, but it was no longer a flicker. It was a steady, burning flame. They had shown their hand, the proposition was on the table, and the pretense was finally, irrevocably, gone. There's a certain clarity that comes after a line has been drawn in the sand. The 2-week period following that disastrous dinner at the Oak Room was a strange, suspended silence. The phone didn't ring with their number. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the tense quiet of waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the first shocking volley. Paul and I moved through our days with a new, unspoken understanding. We were under siege, and we were in this together. He stopped trying to explain away their behavior. He'd come home from the hardware store, and instead of talking about the customers he'd seen, he'd simply squeeze my shoulder, a silent communication of solidarity. We started having our coffee on the back porch in the mornings, watching the birds at the feeder, not talking much, just being. We were shoring up our defenses, and our primary defense was each other. But a part of me, the mother part, was still desperately searching for an explanation that didn't paint my children as villains. Maybe they were just terribly misinformed. Maybe this lawyer friend of Michael's was a bad influence. Maybe the pressure of their high-stakes careers had warped their perspective. The mind will construct incredible labyrinths of denial to avoid facing a simple, painful truth. It was this desperate need for a different answer that led me to do something I'd never done before. I went snooping. It was a Thursday. Paul was out. The silence of the house felt different that day. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to discover something. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up towards the rooms that had once been Michael's and Chloe's. They were long gone, of course, but we'd kept a few of their things: yearbooks, childhood treasures, boxes of old school papers. Maybe, I thought, if I could just look at their childhood selves, I could find the children I knew and remind myself they were still in there. I went to Michael's old room first. The guest bed was neatly made, a bland, inoffensive landscape on the wall where his rock band posters used to be. In the back of the closet, behind the spare blankets, was a plastic storage tub labeled Michael's stuff. My heart ached as I lifted the lid. The smell that wafted out was a time capsule: old paper, a hint of adolescent boy, and the faint sweet scent of the cedar lining we'd put in. On top was his high school letterman jacket. I ran my fingers over the worn leather sleeves, the faded chenille of the M for his school. I remembered him so clearly in this jacket, his arms slung around his girlfriend, his laugh echoing in the hallway. I lifted it out, and beneath it, I saw his baby book. I smiled, a sad, watery smile, and opened it. There was a lock of his fine, baby-fine hair, a dark curl taped to the page. There were his tiny, inky footprints. My throat tightened. This was my boy, the one I had sung to sleep, the one who had to have a nightlight until he was 10 because he was afraid of the dark. How did that boy become the man who coldly discussed our liability of a home over $100 stake? I closed the book, my sentimentality curdling into a sharper, more painful emotion. I dug a little deeper, past the yearbooks and the trophies. And at the very bottom of the tub, tucked away as if hidden, was a slim, black, hardcover notebook. It wasn't a childhood relic. It looked new, expensive. Puzzled, I pulled it out. It was a financial ledger. The first page was in Michael's precise, architectural handwriting. At the top, he'd written, "Family Asset Consolidation Strategy." My blood ran cold. This wasn't a recent idea. This was a plan, a documented one. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. It was all there, laid out with chilling detail. Projected property value of our home over the next 10 years. Estimates of Paul's pension and its diminishing value due to inflation. A column with my bookkeeping income, with a question mark, and the note, "Unreliable divided by variable." He had lists of our monthly expenses, things I didn't even know he was aware of: the cost of our electricity, our water bill, our grocery average. But it was the notes in the margins that stole the breath from my lungs. Next to the figure for our home's value, he'd written, "Chloe's design firm could use a capital injection. This could cover it and then some." Next to the tally of our savings, Dad's sentimental about the '65 Mustang, "Could be liquidated, minimal pushback expected from Mom." And then, on a page titled "Contingencies and Leverage," I read words that made my vision swim. Primary leverage, their fear of being a burden, play on this. Emphasize nursing home costs, medical bankruptcy. Secondary leverage, their love for us divided by desire for family harmony. Use guilt, frame our success as their legacy. Potential obstacle, Mom's stubbornness, likely the bigger problem. Dad will follow her lead if she digs in. Need to isolate her, undermine her confidence. Suggest she's being emotional, not logical. Final option, if cooperation is not achieved, legal avenues may be necessary. Establish grounds for incompetence? Hard to prove. Last resort. I dropped the ledger, as if it had burned me. It clattered to the floor, the pages splaying open, his neat handwriting now looking like the scrawls of a monster. I backed away until my legs hit the bed and I sank onto it, my head in my hands. Isolate her. Undermine her confidence. Incompetence. This wasn't a son thinking of his parents' well-being. This was a strategist planning a hostile takeover. He had been studying us, profiling our weaknesses the way a general studies an enemy fortress. Our love was a leverage point. My protectiveness over our home was stubbornness. My husband was a follower. And I was the bigger problem. The pain was so acute it was physical, a sharp, stabbing sensation in my chest. I thought I'd known hurt when they first presented their plan. But that was a superficial wound compared to this. This was a deep, internal hemorrhage. He had been plotting against us, in secret, for who knows how long, reducing our entire life together, our love, our struggles, our joys, into a column of figures and a list of tactical maneuvers. I don't know how long I sat there, weeping silent, ragged tears onto the guest room comforter. The image of his baby footprints swam in my vision, superimposed over the words, established grounds for incompetence. The unraveling wasn't just of my trust. It was of my entire identity as a mother. What had I done to make him see me as an obstacle, a problem to be managed? When I could finally move, I picked up the ledger. It felt filthy in my hands, a tangible representation of a betrayal so profound I had no name for it. I took it downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table, right in the center. The evidence. I needed Paul to see it. He had to understand this was real. I called Auntie Grace. I couldn't form coherent sentences. I was just sobbing. The ledger, he had a ledger, he wrote things, terrible things. Ruth, breathe, honey, breathe, she cooed, her voice a lifeline. What ledger? What did you find? I read her the lines, the ones about leverage and incompetence. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Oh, my dear girl. Oh, Ruth. I am so sorry. What did I do wrong, Auntie Grace? I begged, the little girl in me screaming in pain. Where did I fail? You listen to me, she said, her voice firming up, becoming almost stern. You did nothing wrong. This is not a reflection on you. This is a sickness in him. A sickness of greed and entitlement. You raised a good, kind boy. The world, his ambition, something, twisted him. This is not your failure, it is his. Her words were a raft in a stormy sea, but I was still drowning. Paul found me there an hour later, sitting at the table, my eyes red raw, staring at the black ledger. He came in, his usual cheerful greeting dying on his lips when he saw my face. Ruth? What's happened? I just pointed a trembling finger at the book. He frowned, picked it up, and started to read. I watched his face change. The genial, slightly weary expression melted away, replaced by a slow dawning horror, then a deep, thunderous anger. His knuckles, where he gripped the book, were white. He read every page. He didn't say a word. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than any we had ever shared. When he finally finished, he closed the book with a sharp snap. He looked at me, and for the first time in our 35 years of marriage, I saw a look of pure, undiluted hatred in my husband's eyes. It wasn't directed at me, it was for our son. He was going to have you declared incompetent? Paul's voice was a low, dangerous growl. My wife? The most capable person I know? He stood up so abruptly his chair screeched backwards. He paced the length of the kitchen, a caged animal. Leverage? Our love is leverage? Our fear is leverage? He stopped and slammed his fist down on the counter, making me jump. The salt and pepper shakers rattled. I'll kill him. I swear to God, Ruth. I'll wring his neck. I had never seen Paul like this. He was the calm one, the peacemaker. This fury was volcanic. Paul, don't, I whispered, though a part of me, a dark, wounded part, thrilled at his fury. It validated my own. Don't, he roared. He's been sitting in this house, eating your food, talking about his day, and all the while he's been writing this blueprint for betrayal in his head. He's not our son. He's a predator. He came over to me, his anger dissolving into a profound, gut-wrenching grief. He knelt beside my chair and put his head in my lap, his broad shoulders shaking. I wrapped my arms around him, and we clung to each other, two shipwrecked souls in the wreckage of the family we had built. The unraveling was complete. Every thread of doubt, every shred of denial, had been pulled away. The beautiful tapestry of our life as a family was revealed to be a lie, and all that was left was the ugly, brutal truth laid bare in a black ledger on a kitchen table. That night, we didn't sleep. We sat at that table, the ledger between us like an unwelcome guest, and we talked. We talked about the years we'd scrimped to send them to good colleges. We talked about the second mortgage we'd taken out to help Michael with the down payment on his first condo. We talked about the countless times we'd babysat for Chloe's friends' children for free, just to help her network. We had always been their safety net. And now they saw that net as a cage, and us as the keepers they needed to escape. The next morning, puffy-eyed and hollow, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this poison in the house. I picked up the ledger. I walked out to the backyard, to the fire pit Paul had built for summer marshmallow roasts with the grandchildren we didn't yet have. I crumpled a few pages of newspaper, placed the ledger on top, and doused it with lighter fluid. Paul came out and stood beside me, wordlessly handing me a match. I struck it. The flame flared, a bright, hungry orange against the gray morning. I dropped it onto the book. The pages caught immediately, the fire consuming the cold, calculated words, the strategic plans, the brutal assessments. We watched as the evidence of our betrayal turned to ash and smoke, rising into the sky. It was a symbolic act, I knew. It didn't change anything. The knowledge was still inside me, a permanent scar. But watching it burn felt like a reclaiming. We were burning their plan. We were burning their disrespect. We were burning the illusion. When the last ember died, I turned to Paul. My voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. They're going to come back. They're not going to just give up. He nodded, his face grim. I know. When they do, I said, looking him straight in the eye. The motherly softness gone from my voice, replaced by the steel Auntie Clara had told me to find. We will be ready. The unraveling was over. The war was about to begin. There is a peculiar kind of calm that settles in after a storm has passed, even when you know it's only the eye, a temporary lull before the winds return with renewed fury. The 2 days after we burned the ledger were like that, a heavy, watchful quiet. Paul and I didn't talk about it much, but the knowledge of what we discovered was a third presence in the house, a ghost at our table. We were different people now. The last vestiges of the parents who made excuses were gone, incinerated along with that black book. I found myself looking at my own home with new eyes. It was no longer just the place filled with memories, it was a fortress. I'd noticed the solid heft of the front door as I closed it, the thickness of the walls, the dependable lock on the back gate. I was seeing its strengths, its defensible positions. Paul, in his own way, did the same. He went down to the basement and came up with a heavy, metal lockbox I hadn't seen in years. He gathered our important documents, the deed to the house, our marriage certificate, the wills we'd drawn up decades ago, our birth certificates, and he locked them away. Just in case, was all he said, and I nodded. We were preparing for a siege. They came on a Sunday. Of course, it was a Sunday. The day for family dinners, for lazy afternoons, for phone calls to catch up, the day associated with peace and rest. They knew that. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. They were reclaiming their territory, on the day that was meant for family. The doorbell rang, a cheerful, normal sound that now felt like an alarm. Paul and I were in the living room, him reading the paper, me pretending to read a novel. We looked at each other. There was no fear in his eyes, only a grim resolve that mirrored my own. "I'll get it," I said, my voice steady. I opened the door. Michael and Chloe stood there, side by side, a united front. They weren't smiling, but they weren't hostile either. They looked determined, resigned, even, as if they were here to perform a difficult but necessary task. "Mom," Michael said, his tone neutral. "Can we come in?" Chloe asked, though it wasn't really a question. She was already stepping across the threshold. I moved back, letting them pass. They walked into the living room and saw Paul, who hadn't gotten up from his chair. He simply folded his newspaper and set it aside, his gaze level and cool. "Dad," Michael said, a note of surprise in his voice at Paul's uncharacteristic stillness. "We need to talk about the house," Chloe began, cutting straight to the chase. She was wearing her business persona, the one she used to impress clients. "We feel like we left things in a bad place and we want to clear the air." "There's no air to clear," I said, coming to stand beside Paul's chair. I rested my hand on his shoulder, feeling the tense muscle beneath his shirt. It grounded me. "The answer is no." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the sound in the world had been sucked out of the room. They hadn't expected this. They had expected negotiation, tears, perhaps more resistance, but not this flat, unadorned, final refusal. Michael's face hardened. "Mom, you're not being rational. This isn't an emotional decision. This is about math. This is about your future security." "Our future security," I said, my voice low and clear, "is not your responsibility. And it is not negotiable." Chloe let out a short, exasperated breath. "See, this is what we were talking about. You're being sentimental. You're clinging to a house when we're offering you a solution." Paul finally spoke, his voice like grinding stones. "It is not a house, it is our home, and you will not speak to your mother that way." Michael turned on him, his patience snapping. "And you? You just sit there and let her make these decisions based on what? Flower beds and memories? That's not how the world works, Dad. The world is cold and it's hard, and it will eat you alive if you're not prepared. We are trying to prepare you. By taking our home from us?" I shot back, the heat rising in my cheeks. "By making us tenants in the place we built? By talking about leveraging our love and our fears?" The change in the room was instantaneous. Michael's face went pale. Chloe's eyes widened in shock. They hadn't known I'd found the ledger. The mask of concerned adulthood slipped, revealing the guilty children beneath. What are you talking about?" Michael stammered, the confident strategist gone. "I found it," I said, my voice trembling now, not with fear, but with a lifetime of hurt finally finding its voice. "I found your book, your family asset consolidation strategy. I read how you plan to use our love as leverage. I saw where you wondered if you could have me declared incompetent." The confession hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Chloe recovered first, her shock turning to defensive fury. "You went through his things. That's an invasion of privacy." "Privacy," Paul roared, surging to his feet. The force of it made both of them take a step back. "You were plotting against us in our own home. You don't get to talk about privacy. It was just a plan." Michael shouted back, his composure completely shattered. "A thought exercise. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. You have no idea what it takes to be successful. I was trying to protect what's rightfully mine, ours." And there it was, the core of it, finally vomited up into the light. What's rightfully mine? The last of my heart, the part that had still, foolishly, hoped for a different ending, shriveled and died in that moment. I looked at my son, his face contorted with a greed so profound it had erased the boy I knew. I looked at my daughter, standing beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous indignation. And I knew. I knew with a certainty that was both terrible and liberating. "Get out," I said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the noise like a knife. They both stared at me, stunned. "What?" Chloe said, a disbelieving laugh escaping her. "Mom, be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life," I said, my voice gaining strength, filling the room. "Get out of my house." "This is our house, too," Michael yelled, gesturing wildly around him. "We grew up here. We have a right to it." "You have a right to nothing," Paul thundered, stepping forward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might actually strike his own son. "You forfeited any right the moment you started seeing us as a portfolio to be managed. Now your mother told you to leave, so get out. You're choosing a building over your own children?" Chloe's voice was a shrill, wounded thing. It was the master stroke, the ultimate guilt trip, the weapon she had been saving. "You're throwing us out? Your own flesh and blood?" I looked at her, and I felt a profound, bottomless sadness. This was it. The moment of fracture. There was no going back. "No," I said, and my voice was eerily calm now, the eye of my own personal hurricane. "You made that choice, you left us a long time ago, you just forgot to tell us. You are not throwing a tantrum because you can't have a toy. You are grown adults trying to bully your parents out of their home, and I will not have it. This is my line. You will not cross it." I walked to the front door and held it open. The autumn air, crisp and clean, swept into the stuffy, hate-filled room. "If you ever want to come back to us as our children," I said, looking from one shocked face to the other, "as the people we raised you to be, you are welcome, but you will come with respect. You will come with love. You will not come for what you can take. Until then, you are not welcome here." For a long moment nobody moved. It was a standoff. I could see the calculations going on behind Michael's eyes, the fury warring with the shock. I saw the bitter tears welling in Chloe's, the sense of theatrical betrayal. Then Michael sneered. It was an expression I had never seen on his face before, ugly and contemptuous. "Fine. Have it your way. Live in your crumbling museum. But don't come crying to us when you lose it all. You've made your bed." He strode past me, not looking back. Chloe hesitated for a second longer, her eyes locking with mine. There was a universe of pain in that look, but it was a selfish pain, the pain of a child whose scheme has been thwarted. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice venomous, and then she followed her brother out the door. I closed the door. I turned the deadbolt. The sound of the bolt sliding home was the loudest, most final sound I had ever heard. I turned around and leaned against the door, my legs suddenly weak. Paul was standing in the middle of the living room, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. The fight had gone out of him, leaving only a vast, empty sorrow. We had done it. We had drawn the line. We had said no. And in doing so, we had lost our children. The silence that descended was different from all the others. It was the silence of a house that is truly, finally, empty, not of people, but of a future. The ghost of grandchildren's laughter that I had always imagined echoing in these halls, it died that day. The hope of family Christmases, of Sunday dinners, of my children caring for me in my old age with tenderness, not with ledgers and legal documents, it was gone. I slid down the length of the door until I was sitting on the floor, the cool wood against my back. Paul came and sat beside me, his big body folding itself down next to mine. He didn't say anything. He just took my hand, lacing his thick, work-roughened fingers through mine. We sat there on the floor, in the hallway of the home we had refused to surrender, surrounded by the ghosts of the family we had just exiled, and we wept. We wept for the children we had loved. We wept for the future we had lost. We wept for the terrible, painful victory of saving our home, at the cost of our hearts. A mother's refusal. It sounds so strong, so definitive. And in a way it was. But that day, it felt like the most devastating failure of my life. I had protected the nest, but the birds had flown, and they were never, ever coming back. They say that in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic amputation, patients often experience phantom limb syndrome, a vivid, persistent sensation that the lost arm or leg is still there, itching, hurting, even feeling cold. For weeks after Michael and Chloe walked out of our lives, that's exactly what our family life felt like. A phantom limb. I'd set the table for 4 out of habit, then stand there, staring at the 2 empty places, my hand trembling as I put the extra plates and forks away. I'd hear a car door slam outside and my heart would leap, a conditioned reflex before the cold reality washed over me. It wasn't them. It would never be them. The silence was the worst of it. It wasn't peaceful. It was a predatory silence. It lurked in the corners of the house, waiting to pounce on the slightest sound. The cheerful jingle of the phone became a source of anxiety. Every time it rang, Paul and I would freeze, our eyes meeting in a shared, unspoken question. Is it them? Is this the call where they apologize, where they see the terrible mistake they've made? But the phone didn't ring with their numbers. Their silence was a weapon, and they wielded it with brutal efficiency. It was a punishment. They were teaching us a lesson. See what happens when you defy us. See the emptiness you've chosen? Paul retreated into a shell of quiet activity. He'd spend hours in the garage, organizing, though I knew he was just trying to outrun the grief. The sound of him sanding a piece of wood or tinkering with an old radio was the only thing that fought back against the oppressive quiet. I tried to lose myself in my bookkeeping, but the numbers blurred on the screen. My concentration was shattered. How could I care about a bakery's profit and loss when my own family's ledger was so catastrophically in the red? The shock began to wear off after about 10 days, replaced by a dull, constant ache. It was during this time that the outside world, which had felt so distant, began to intrude in strange and painful ways. It started with a voicemail from Sarah, an old friend from my college days who lived across the country. Her voice was light, chatty. "Ruth, just thinking about you. I had the strangest dream about you and Paul last night, and I just had to call. Give me a ring when you have a chance." It was innocent enough, but a prickle of unease went down my spine. Why now? The next day, it was my cousin, Diane. We weren't particularly close, but we exchanged Christmas cards and the occasional email. Her message was more pointed. "Ruth, honey, it's Diane. Listen, I just got off the phone with my daughter Jessica. You remember her? She's friends with Chloe on that Facebook thing. She mentioned something. Well, she said Chloe posted something a bit cryptic about family not being defined by blood, but by loyalty. Is everything all right over there? You know you can talk to me." My hands were ice cold. They were talking. Michael and Chloe were spreading their version of the story. They were building their narrative, painting themselves as the wounded parties, the loyal children betrayed by stubborn, unreasonable parents. The final blow came on a Saturday morning. The doorbell rang. Paul and I both flinched. We weren't expecting anyone. I peered through the sidelight and saw our neighbor, Brenda, standing on the porch, holding a baking dish covered in tin foil. Brenda was a lovely woman, a few years younger than me, with whom I'd shared countless cups of coffee and conversations over the backyard fence. I opened the door, forcing a smile. "Brenda, what a nice surprise." "I made a lasagna," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She thrust the dish toward me. "I thought you and Paul could use a night off from cooking." It was a kind gesture, but there was an awkwardness in her stance, a pity in her gaze that made my skin crawl. "That's so thoughtful of you," I said, taking the heavy dish. "Thank you. Would you like to come in?" She shifted her weight. "Oh no, I can't stay. The kids are, you know." She paused, and then the real reason for her visit tumbled out. I saw Michael the other day, at the gas station over on Elm." My heart stopped. "Oh?" He looked upset," Brenda said, her voice dropping into a confidential tone. "We chatted for a minute. He said he was worried about you and Paul, that you were having a hard time adjusting, that you were refusing help, and that he and Chloe were just heartsick about it." The lasagna in my hands felt like a block of lead. This was their strategy: isolate us, undermine us. They were poisoning the well, turning our community, our friends, against us with a story of two poor, worried children and their irrational, aging parents. I looked at Brenda, at her concerned, gossip-hungry face, and I felt a surge of white-hot anger, so pure it nearly blinded me. But I choked it down. I would not give her, or them, the satisfaction. I kept my voice even, a monumental effort. "That's kind of him to be concerned. But Paul and I are just fine, Brenda, truly. We're enjoying the peace and quiet." I gave her a serene smile, the biggest performance of my life. Please don't worry about us." Her face fell slightly, disappointed that I wasn't going to supply the drama she was clearly hoping for. "Well, all right then, if you're sure. Enjoy the lasagna." I closed the door, my serene smile collapsing the moment it was out of her sight. I carried the lasagna to the kitchen and set it on the counter. I stared at it, this symbol of poisoned charity. Paul came in. Who was that? Brenda. What did she want? "She brought us a lasagna," I said, my voice flat. "And a message from Michael." I told him what Brenda had said. As I spoke, his face darkened, the color rising in his neck. "They're smearing us," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're telling people we're losing our minds. They're laying the groundwork," I corrected him, the strategist's daughter coming out in me. "Just like in the ledger. Establish grounds for incompetence. They're starting with whispers, making people wonder." The shock was now completely gone, burned away by a clean, sharp fury. The phantom limb was gone. In its place was the raw, throbbing nerve of the amputation. There was no more ambiguity. This was a war, and the battle lines were being drawn in our own neighborhood. I picked up the phone. This time, I didn't call my aunts for comfort. I called them for a council of war. I went to Auntie Grace's house that afternoon. Her home was the opposite of mine, a cozy, cluttered apartment filled with doilies, porcelain figurines, and the rich, comforting smell of cinnamon and vanilla. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a tight, wordless hug. She led me to her kitchen table, poured 2 cups of strong, sweet tea, and listened as I told her about Brenda's visit. When I finished, she shook her head, her kind eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Oh, the foolish, foolish children. They think they're being clever. They don't realize they're burning every bridge back to you." "What do I do, Grace?" I asked, the desperation creeping back in. "How do I fight whispers?" "You don't," said a voice from the doorway. We both looked up. Auntie Clara stood there, having let herself in with her own key. She must have come straight over after Grace called her. She was wearing her gardening clothes, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked like a vengeful earth spirit. "You don't fight whispers, Ruth," she repeated, coming to the table and sitting down without being asked. "You give them nothing to whisper about. You hold your head high. You live your life so joyfully, so obviously in your right mind, that their whispers make them look like the fools they are. But they're telling people we're incompetent," I protested. "And you are acting like it." Clara fired back, her gaze sharp. "Sitting here, trembling over a lasagna and neighborhood gossip. Is this the woman who raised 2 children and ran a household? Is this the woman who built a bookkeeping business from her kitchen table? Where is she?" Her words were a slap, but a necessary one. "You want to fight back?" Clara continued, her voice softening a fraction. "Then fight. But fight the right way. You and Paul. Go out to dinner. Go to the movies. Take a walk in the park and hold hands. Let people see you living, and living well. Let your life be your rebuttal. The truth has a way of shining through, Ruth, but you have to polish it every single day." I looked from Clara's stern, wise face to Grace's compassionate one. They were the twin pillars of my strength. One offered the sword, the other the shield. I went home that evening with a new resolve. Paul was in the living room, staring at the television without seeing it. "Get your jacket," I said. He looked up, puzzled. "What? Why?" "We're going out," I said. "To Mario's. It was our favorite little Italian place, a trattoria we hadn't been to in months." "Ruth, I'm not really in the mood." "I don't care," I said, my voice firm. "We are not going to sit in this house and let them win. We are going to go out, and we are going to have a nice dinner, and we are going to act like the happy, capable, sane people that we are." A slow, grim smile spread across Paul's face. He saw the fire in my eyes. He stood up. "All right then, let's go." We went to Mario's. We didn't talk about Michael or Chloe. We talked about the food. We talked about maybe taking a trip to the coast. We talked about repainting the living room. We held hands across the table. We even shared a tiramisu. We were performing, yes, but the performance began to feel real. For a few hours, we were just Ruth and Paul, a couple out for a nice dinner, and we saw people we knew. The Hendersons from a few streets over waved. Dr. Evans, our old dentist, stopped by the table to say hello. They saw us. They saw us smiling. They saw us together. They saw that we were not the broken, confused people our children were making us out to be. It was a small act of defiance, but it was a start. The silence was no longer just something we endured. It was something we were learning to fill with the sound of our own lives, however fractured they might be. The shock had subsided, leaving behind the hard, unyielding reality of the battlefield. And I was finally ready to pick up my weapons. Filling the silence became our new occupation. Paul and I developed a routine, a careful architecture of distraction. We went for long walks after dinner, our hands linked, not saying much, but presenting a united front to the neighborhood. We started a jigsaw puzzle, a maddeningly complex, one of a Venetian canal on the card table in the living room, a silent, shared focus that kept our minds from wandering into dark corners. We even, at Clara's blunt suggestion, started watching a gripping British detective series on television, becoming oddly invested in fictional murders to avoid confronting the real-life one that had happened to our family. But the mind has a way of wandering back to the scene of the crime, especially in the quiet moments. Lying awake at night, with Paul's steady breathing beside me, the questions would come, unbidden and venomous. Why? What had we done? Was it something I said? Something I didn't do? Had I loved them too much? Not enough? Had I spoiled them? Been too strict? The questions were a torturous loop with no exit. It was during one of these sleepless nights, the digital clock reading 3:17 a.m., that a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was from when Michael was about 14. He'd wanted a new, top-of-the-line gaming console that all his friends had. Paul and I had said no. It was expensive, and we were saving for a new roof. Michael had been furious. He'd slammed his bedroom door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall in the hallway. "You just don't want me to be happy," he'd screamed, his voice cracking with adolescent rage. "You don't want me to have what everyone else has. You're embarrassed that we're not rich." I had stood outside his door, my hand pressed against the wood, feeling his anger like a physical force. I'd tried to explain about priorities, about responsibility, but he wouldn't listen. For 2 weeks, he'd barely spoken to us, moving through the house like a sullen ghost. Then, one day, he'd just gotten over it, or so I'd thought. Lying there in the dark, I wondered if that was the seed. The first time he saw our love not as unconditional, but as a transaction that had failed to pay out. The next morning, bleary-eyed and heavy-hearted, I went to see Auntie Grace. I found her in her tiny, sun-drenched conservatory, repotting geraniums. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, moved with a gentle, practiced precision. "I don't understand, Grace," I said, sinking into a wicker chair, the scent of damp earth and flowers filling my senses. "We weren't perfect, but we were good parents. We loved them. We provided for them. We went to every school play, every soccer game. How did they become this?" Grace didn't look up from her work. She carefully tamped soil around the roots of a vibrant red plant. "You're looking for a reason, Ruthie. A single moment you can point to and say, 'There, that's where I went wrong.' But life isn't like that. It's 1,000 little moments, 1,000 choices. Some of them yours, most of them theirs. But we gave them everything," I whispered, the ache in my chest fresh and raw. "Ah," she said, finally looking at me, her eyes wise and sad. "And maybe that was the problem." She wiped her hands on her apron and came to sit opposite me. "Your generation, you were determined to give your children more than you had. You worked so hard to make life easier for them. You smoothed every path, cleared every obstacle. But Ruth, my dear, you cannot clear the obstacle of a child's own character. And you cannot teach strength by removing every struggle. Her words landed with the weight of truth. I thought of the times I'd interceded with a teacher over a bad grade. The times Paul had fixed a broken toy instead of showing Michael how to do it himself. The way we'd always been the safety net, so omnipresent they never had to learn what it felt like to fall. We created a world for them where they felt entitled to the net, I said, the realization dawning like a cold, gray morning. They never saw it as a gift, they saw it as a right. And when we wouldn't hand over the last piece of it, the house, they saw it as a theft. Grace nodded slowly. You built them a beautiful, comfortable cage, and they never learned how to fly on their own. So now, they're rattling the bars, angry at the keepers. It was a devastating reframing of my entire life's work as a mother. I had thought I was building them a foundation. Instead, I had built them a cage, and I was the warden they needed to overthrow. Later that week, I relayed this conversation to Auntie Clara over a cup of bitter, black coffee at her impeccably tidy kitchen table. Her response was, as always, more direct. Grace is too kind, Clara stated, not unkindly. She talks about cages and nets. I'll give it to you straight, Ruth. You raised two thoroughbreds. You fed them the best oats, brushed their coats until they shone, put them in the finest stables. And now they're surprised that the farmer that's you wants to keep the farm. They think they're the prize, and the farm is just part of the winnings. I almost choked on my coffee. That's a terrible analogy. It's an accurate one, she retorted. You're looking for a flaw in your parenting. The flaw wasn't in the parenting, it was in the world you parented them in. A world that tells them they're special for just existing. A world that values things over character. You fought against that tide every day, but the tide is strong, Ruth. It wears down. The strongest cliffs. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes boring into mine. Stop trying to find your mistake. Your mistake was loving them, providing for them, and expecting that to be enough in a world that teaches them it's never enough. The problem isn't in your past, it's in their present. And in your future, if you let them dictate it. The whispers of the past weren't just my own tortured recollections. They were the echoes of my aunt's wisdom, helping me to reinterpret the story of my life. I began to see a pattern, not of a single catastrophic failure, but of a slow, cultural drift that I had been powerless to stop. I remembered Chloe, at 16, sobbing in her room because a boy she liked had told her she wasn't as pretty as her friend. My instinct had been to hold her, to tell her she was beautiful, to buy her a new dress. I had soothed the symptom, but I hadn't been able to cure the disease. A world that taught her her value was tied to a boy's opinion. I remembered Michael, in his 20s, devastated when he didn't get a promotion he felt he deserved. We had listened to his frustrations, offered support. But had we ever said, maybe you need to work harder? No, we had tacitly agreed with his sense of injustice, reinforcing the idea that the world owed him something. These weren't moments of bad parenting. They were moments of very normal parenting in an abnormal world. A world that had whispered to them, constantly, that they deserved more. That they were the center of the universe, that happiness was a commodity to be acquired. And the biggest commodity of all? Security. The one thing Paul and I had worked our whole lives to build. Our home was the ultimate symbol of that security. And in their world, if you see something you want, you take it. You leverage for it, you consolidate it. One afternoon, while Paul was at the hardware store, I found myself standing in the doorway of the garage. He had indeed been organizing. Neat shelves held labeled boxes. His tools hung in perfect order on a pegboard, and in the corner, under a dust cover, was the shape of his 1965 Mustang. Minimal pushback expected from Mom. I walked over and pulled the cover off. The car was a masterpiece, a deep blue, lovingly restored by Paul over the course of a decade. It was his pride and joy, his escape. He'd taught Michael how to change the oil in this car. He'd taken Chloe for a spin in it on her 16th birthday, her laughter trailing behind them like a ribbon. Michael hadn't just seen a car to be liquidated. He had seen a repository of his father's soul, and he had been willing to cash it in. The shock of that realization was no longer hot and angry. It was a cold, settled grief. When Paul came home, I was sitting on an overturned bucket, just looking at the car. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I was just thinking," I said, my voice soft, "about the world we raised them in. We were so busy protecting them from the hard edges, we forgot to show them how to build something of their own that was strong enough to withstand them." Paul came and stood beside me, looking at his beloved Mustang. He understood. He put his arm around my shoulders. "We did the best we could with what we knew, Ruth." "I know," I said, leaning into him. "But our best wasn't enough. And that's the hardest truth of all to swallow." The whispers of the past had finally fallen silent. There were no more ghosts at the table, no more phantom limbs. There was only the clear, unflinching present. We had not failed as parents. We had parented in a world that had failed our children. And in realizing that, a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. The guilt began to recede, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking pity for the people our children had become. They were rich in ambition but poor in spirit, owners of many things but masters of none, including themselves. The battle for our home was no longer just about property. It was about principle. It was about proving that some things, love, integrity, the sweat of your own brow, could not be consolidated, leveraged, or sold. There is a moment, after the shock and the grief and the frantic search for reasons, when you have to get down to the grim, unglamorous business of assessing the damage. It's like walking through the wreckage after a tornado has passed. The initial terror is gone, replaced by a numb, methodical need to sort through the splinters, to see what's shattered beyond repair, and what, against all odds, might be salvaged. For Paul and me, that moment came on a cold, bright Monday morning in early November. The colorful leaves were mostly gone, leaving the trees as stark, skeletal silhouettes against a pale blue sky. It was a day for practicality. The emotional storm had passed, and the debris of our former life was all around us. It was time to take stock. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Michael had first laid out his chilling proposition. Between us, we had a notepad, a calculator, and a fresh pot of coffee. This was our ledger now. Not a ledger of assets to be consolidated, but a ledger of loss, and we were going to account for every last penny of it. "All right," Paul said, his voice rough but steady. He was wearing his reading glasses, and he looked older than he had just a month ago. "Let's start with the obvious. The house." I nodded, my pen poised. "We own it outright. No mortgage." "Property taxes," he said, and I wrote down the figure. It was substantial, but manageable. "Insurance," I added that number. "Utilities. Average monthly." I wrote it down. "General maintenance fund." We estimated a yearly amount and divided it by 12. We looked at the total. It was a significant monthly outlay, but one our combined income, his pension, and my bookkeeping could cover. We weren't rich, but we were solvent. The picture Michael and Chloe had painted of us teetering on the brink of financial ruin was a fiction, a scare tactic. "They lied," Paul said quietly, staring at the numbers. "They flat out lied to us about our own finances. They presented a worst-case scenario as an inevitability," I corrected, though the distinction felt thin. "They used fear." We moved on. We listed our savings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was our safety net, the one we had woven ourselves, thread by thread, over 35 years. Then we listed our monthly income. Again, the numbers added up. We weren't a liability. We were a stable, if modest, economic unit. Then came the harder part, the emotional ledger. "The Mustang," I said softly, not looking at him. Paul was silent for a long moment. "He wanted to sell my car," he said, the betrayal still fresh in his voice. He knew what it meant to me. It wasn't about the money. It was about erasing me. I wrote down 65, Mustang, sentimental value, priceless in our ledger of loss. "My mother's pearls," I said. "Chloe always loved them. I'd always intended for her to have them." Now, my voice trailed off. The thought of her wearing them, perhaps at a business meeting paid for with the money from our home, made me feel sick. I wrote down pearls, legacy, broken. We went on like that, itemizing the intangible devastations. Trust in our children, total loss. Future with grandchildren, extinguished. Family holidays, forfeited. Peace of mind, severely damaged. Reputation in community, under assault. The list grew, a heartbreaking column of everything that had been stolen from us, not by strangers, but by the people we had loved most in the world. By the time we finished, the page was full. The numbers for the house and savings were just figures, but the list of emotional losses was a gaping, painful wound. Paul took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "So, this is where we are. This is where we are," I echoed, my voice hollow. We sat in silence for a while, the ledger of loss lying between us like an accusation. I looked at it, at the stark reality of our situation, and something inside me shifted. The numbness began to recede, burned away by a slow, building fire. This was it. This was the bottom. And from here, there was only one way to go, up. "No," I said, the words sharp and clear in the quiet kitchen. Paul looked at me. "No, what?" "No, this isn't the end of the story." I picked up the notepad and tore off the top sheet, the one filled with our losses. I crumpled it into a tight ball and dropped it on the table. "This is a list of what they've taken, but it's not a list of what we have left." I turned to a fresh page. At the top I wrote, "Assets." Paul watched me, a flicker of curiosity in his weary eyes. "What do we have?" I asked, my pen ready. "What didn't they take?" "Well," Paul said slowly, thinking, "we have each other." I wrote it down. Each other. Solid. "We have this house," I said, free and clear. "The house, security, ours. We have our health." It was a cliché, but in that moment, it felt profoundly true. Our health, good. "We have our wits," Paul added, a grim smile touching his lips, despite what they might be telling people. "Our minds, sound." "We have my bookkeeping business," I said. "It's small, but it's mine. It's reliable. My business, independent income." "We have our friends," I continued, thinking of my aunts, of the few people who had seen through the whispers. "The ones who matter." True friends, a few. I looked at the new list. It was shorter than the list of losses, but the items on it were solid, real, unassailable. They were things that could not be leveraged or consolidated because they were rooted in who we were, not what we owned. "We need a lawyer," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I'd even fully formed the thought. Paul's eyebrows shot up. "A lawyer? Ruth, what for?" "We're not suing them." "Not yet," I said, the new fire inside me growing brighter. "But they threatened it. They talked about legal avenues and incompetence. We can't just sit here and wait for them to make the next move. We need to know our rights. We need to protect what's left. We need to build a fortress around this new ledger." The determination in my voice surprised even me. This wasn't the reactive, wounded mother anymore. This was a general, looking at a map of the battlefield and planning a defense. Paul studied me for a long moment, and then he nodded, a slow, decisive dip of his chin. "All right, you're right. Where do we start?" I didn't know any lawyers. Our lives had been blessedly free of legal entanglements, but I knew someone who would. I picked up the phone and called Auntie Clara. "Clara," I said, without preamble. We need a lawyer, a good one. Someone who isn't afraid of a fight. There was a beat of silence on the other end, and then I heard what might have been a grunt of approval. Took you long enough. I've been waiting for this call. Give me an hour. True to her word, she called back 57 minutes later. Eleanor Vance, she said. Her office is downtown. She specializes in elder law and estate litigation. She's sharp, she's ruthless when she needs to be, and she hates bullies. I've already spoken to her. She can see you tomorrow at 10. The following day, Paul and I dressed with a care we usually reserve for funerals or weddings. We were going into battle, and our armor was our dignity. Eleanor Vance's office was in a modern building of glass and steel, a world away from our cozy, lived-in home. The waiting room was quiet and tasteful, and the woman who emerged to greet us was exactly as Clara had described, sharp. She was probably in her late 40s, with intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor. She wore a beautifully cut navy blue suit and shook our hands with a firm, dry grip. "Ruth, Paul," she said. "Please, come in. Clara has told me a little, but I'd like to hear it from you." We sat in her spacious office, with its panoramic view of the city, and we told her everything. It was different from telling my aunts. This was not a recitation for comfort or wisdom, it was a deposition. We showed her the new ledger we'd made the list of our assets. We told her about the dinner at the Oak Room, the ledger I'd found, the confrontation, the silence, the whispers in the neighborhood. We held nothing back. Eleanor Vance listened, taking occasional notes, her expression neutral. When we finished, she set her pen down and steepled her fingers. "First," she said, her voice calm and precise, "you have done nothing wrong. You are of sound mind, you are financially solvent, and you are under no obligation, moral or legal, to sign your home over to your children. What they proposed was, at best, profoundly disrespectful, and at worst, a prelude to financial abuse. Hearing a professional, an authority, confirm what we knew in our hearts was a validation so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. I blinked them back fiercely. Their actions, the ledger, the smear campaign, are concerning," she continued. "They indicate a coordinated effort to exert control and to isolate you. The mention of incompetence is a significant red flag. It suggests they were or are considering a conservatorship petition." "A what?" Paul asked, his face pale. "It's a legal proceeding where a court would be asked to find that you are incapable of managing your own affairs and to appoint someone, in this case, likely one or both of your children, to do it for you," she explained. "It strips you of your rights. It is a nuclear option, and based on what you've told me, they would have no grounds for it. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't try." The room seemed to tilt. They hadn't just wanted our house. They had wanted to take away our very right to make decisions for ourselves. The ledger's words, "establish grounds for incompetence," now felt less like a threat and more like a blueprint. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Eleanor Vance gave us a small, grim smile. "We get ahead of it. We make you bulletproof. We start by having new wills and powers of attorney drawn up, naming anyone but your children as your executors and agents. A trust would be an excellent idea, to protect your assets and outline your wishes clearly and irrevocably. We create a paper trail a mile long that proves your mental and financial competence. We build a legal fortress so imposing that they would be fools to even approach it." She looked from Paul to me, her gaze steady. "This will cost money. It will be stressful. And it will make the conflict with your children official and permanent. There will be no going back after this. You need to be sure you're ready." Paul and I looked at each other. In his eyes, I saw the same resolve that was burning in my own. We had already lost our children. There was nothing left to lose but our freedom, and we would not surrender that. I turned back to Eleanor Vance. "We're ready," I said. "Please, build us our fortress." The ledger of loss was closed. We were now writing a new chapter, and its title was Fortification. The weeks that followed our meeting with Eleanor Vance were a strange and disorienting time. We were building our fortress, just as she had promised, but the process felt less like construction and more like an archaeological dig into our own mortality. We spent hours in her office, surrounded by the cool, clean scent of law books and lemon-scented polish, answering deeply personal questions under the sterile glare of fluorescent lights. We drafted new wills. The old ones, written when the children were small, had left everything to them, with Paul and I as each other's executors. It had seemed so simple, so natural. Now, we sat with Eleanor and deliberately, painstakingly, wrote them out of our final wishes. We named my cousin, a steady, kind-hearted woman who lived 2 states away, as our executor. We left small, symbolic bequests to a few cherished friends and the bulk of our estate, including the house, to a charitable trust for a local children's library. The thought of Michael and Chloe getting so much as a teacup from this house now felt like a violation. We created a revocable living trust, a complex legal entity that now technically owned our assets, with Paul and I as the trustees. It was a labyrinthine structure designed for one primary purpose: to make it virtually impossible for anyone, including aggrieved adult children, to challenge our decisions or get their hands on our property. "It's like building a moat," Eleanor explained one afternoon, pointing to a dense paragraph in the trust documents, "and then filling it with alligators. They can look at the castle, but they can't get across the moat." We signed durable powers of attorney for healthcare and finances, granting those rights to each other, and then to Auntie Clara as a successor. "Clara?" Paul had asked, surprised. "Not Grace?" "Grace has the heart for it," I'd said. "But Clara has the spine. If we're ever unable to speak for ourselves, I want the person holding the power to be someone who cannot be bullied." The most surreal part was the competency evaluation. At Eleanor's suggestion, we each underwent a full psychological assessment with a geriatric specialist. We sat in another office, this one decorated with soothing landscapes, and answered questions about current events, performed memory tests, and discussed our financial plans in detail. It was humiliating and empowering all at once. We were proving our sanity, preemptively defending ourselves against our children's potential accusations. We walked out of there, with notarized letters, stating we were both fully oriented, possessing testamentary capacity, and entirely capable of managing our own affairs. We framed the letters and hung them in our hallway, a bizarre and bitter trophy. We were fortifying, but the outside world continued its slow, painful adjustment to our new reality. The holiday season descended, a time that had always been the beating heart of our family life. The absence of it all was a constant, dull ache. There were no debates over whose house we would go to for Thanksgiving. No frantic shopping for the perfect gifts for Michael and Chloe. No planning of menus or the hanging of stockings. On Thanksgiving morning, the silence in the house was particularly profound. Paul and I decided we couldn't bear the thought of a traditional dinner, with its ghosts of laughter and overfull plates. So, we did something we had never done before. We packed a picnic basket with turkey sandwiches, a thermos of hot soup, and a slice of pumpkin pie, and we drove to the coast. The beach in November was deserted and wild. The sky was a flat, gray sheet, and the wind whipped off the water, stinging our faces. We sat on a driftwood log, wrapped in thick blankets, and ate our sandwiches, watching the relentless crash of the steel-gray waves. "It's not so bad," Paul said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It's quiet." "It's a different kind of quiet," I replied, pulling the blanket tighter. "It's a chosen quiet." And it was. It was lonely, yes, but it was ours. We weren't sitting in a house haunted by the echoes of a family that no longer existed. We were out in the world, making a new memory, however bittersweet. We were learning the geography of our loss, and in doing so, we were reclaiming a piece of ourselves. We thought our legal preparations were a defensive measure, a shield. We didn't realize our children were already sharpening their swords. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, just 2 weeks before Christmas. It was a thick, official-looking envelope from a law firm I'd never heard of, Sterling and Cox. My heart plummeted into my stomach. I carried it into the kitchen, my hands trembling, and laid it on the table in front of Paul. He looked at it, his face hardening into a mask. "Well," he said. "I guess they didn't like the moat." We opened it together. The language was dense, legalese, but the intent was chillingly clear. It was a petition filed in probate court by Michael and Chloe Sterling, seeking the appointment of a temporary conservator for their mother, Ruth Sterling, citing concerns regarding financial exploitation and diminished capacity. I had to read it twice. Financial exploitation? By whom, Paul? Diminished capacity? The petition was a masterpiece of malicious innuendo. It cited my isolation from friends and family, a neat twisting of their own smear campaign. It mentioned my unexplained legal consultations with Eleanor Vance they must have had us followed. It claimed I was vulnerable to undue influence from my husband, who was, according to the document, under her thrall and complicit in the alienation of her children. It was a web of half-truths and outright lies, designed to present a picture of a confused, manipulated old woman being led to the poorhouse by her domineering husband. The proposed conservator? Michael Sterling. He was asking the court for the legal power to manage all my finances, to control my assets, to make all my medical decisions. He was asking a judge to declare me incompetent. I felt the room spin. The framed competency letter in the hallway seemed to mock me. All our preparations, our fortress building, and they had just launched a direct assault on the main gate. Paul was on his feet, his chair clattering to the floor behind him. His face was a terrifying shade of purple. "I'll kill him," he snarled, his fists clenched. "I swear to God, Ruth, I will find him and I will kill him." "Paul, no," I said, my own voice surprisingly calm, though my whole body was shaking. "That's what they want. They want us to be irrational. They want us to look unstable." I picked up the phone, my movements slow and deliberate. "They want to fight? Then they've come to the right place." I called Eleanor Vance. Her receptionist put me straight through. "Eleanor," I said, my voice like ice. "They've filed a conservatorship petition for me." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a string of language far less professional than her usual demeanor. "Email me a copy. Now. I'll call you back in 30 minutes. We scanned and emailed the documents. The 30-minute wait was the longest of my life. Paul paced the kitchen like a caged tiger, while I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, focusing on my breathing. The initial shock was giving way to a cold, focused fury. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. This was no longer about a house. This was about my personhood. Eleanor's call was a battle cry. "All right," she said, her voice crackling with energy. "The gloves are off. This is an outrage, and we are going to fight it with everything we have. This is not just a legal proceeding anymore, Ruth. This is a war for your autonomy, and we are going to win." She outlined the strategy. We would file a motion to dismiss, attaching our competency evaluations, and a sworn affidavit from us detailing the entire history of their coercion and threats. We would subpoena Michael's financial records, looking for any evidence of his own instability or motive. We would depose both Michael and Chloe, forcing them to answer, under oath, for every lie in that petition. "They have made a catastrophic miscalculation," Eleanor said, her voice grimly satisfied. "They have assumed you are weak and alone. They have no idea the fortress they are trying to storm." The next few days were a blur of activity. We were in and out of Eleanor's office, signing papers, reviewing strategies. We told our story, again and again, to Eleanor and her associates, each time reliving the betrayal, but now channeling the pain into fuel. Auntie Clara and Auntie Grace became our unwavering support system, bringing food, handling our mail, forming a protective circle around us. The date for the initial hearing was set for mid-January. As we left Eleanor's office after a particularly grueling session, I stopped on the steps of the courthouse, the cold winter air sharp in my lungs. The city sprawled out before me, impersonal and vast. Paul took my hand. "You all right?" I looked at him, at my husband of 35 years, who was ready to stand beside me in this, the most unthinkable of battles. I thought of my aunts, my fortress of a lawyer, the small, solid list of assets on our new ledger. They thought they were dealing with a mother, I said, my breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. A soft, sentimental mother who would crumble under pressure. I turned to face him, a steely resolve settling in my soul. They have no idea who they're actually dealing with. The reckoning had come. But it was not our reckoning, it was theirs, and they were about to learn the price of trying to break a woman who had already learned how to build herself from the ground up. The weeks between the arrival of that devastating petition and the day of the hearing were a strange, suspended reality. Christmas came and went, a muted, somber affair with just Paul, myself, and my two aunts. We exchanged simple gifts and ate a small, quiet meal. There were no carols, no tree. It felt like we were holding our breath, conserving every ounce of our energy for the battle ahead. The festive lights in the neighborhood seemed garish, a celebration we were no longer part of. Eleanor Vance was a marvel of preparation. She had us rehearse our testimony until we could have delivered it in our sleep. She taught us how to answer questions to be clear, concise, and to never ever lose our temper. She warned us about the other side's tactics. Their lawyer, a man named Robert Gable, is a bulldog, she told us. He's going to try to provoke you, to make you look emotional, irrational. He'll twist your words. You must remain calm. You are the sane, reasonable parents. They are the greedy, opportunistic children. That is the picture we will paint for the judge. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the possible outcomes playing like a horror movie in my mind. What if the judge believed them? What if I was declared incompetent, stripped of my rights, my voice? The fear was a cold living thing in my chest. Paul's hand found mine in the dark. "We have the truth, Ruth," he whispered, his voice steady and sure. "And we have each other. That's more than they have." The county courthouse was a monument to grim bureaucracy, all echoing marble hallways and the smell of old paper and anxiety. We met Eleanor in a small windowless conference room. She looked impeccable in a dark tailored suit, a warrior queen ready for combat. "Remember," she said, her eyes scanning ours, calm, clear, factual. "The judge is a woman, Judge Isabella Moreno. She's smart, she's fair, and she has no patience for nonsense. Let Michael and Chloe provide the nonsense." When we walked into the courtroom, my legs felt like water. It was smaller than I'd imagined, all dark wood and solemnity, and there they were. Michael and Chloe, sitting at the opposite table with their lawyer, Robert Gable. He was a florid-faced man with a comb-over and a pinstripe suit that seemed too tight. My children looked different. Michael was in an expensive, somber suit, playing the part of the concerned, responsible son. Chloe was dressed in a severe, conservative dress, her face a mask of strained sorrow. They didn't look at us. The bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Isabella Moreno." The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense graying bun. She seated herself and looked over the room, her gaze lingering for a moment on our table, then on theirs. The hearing began. Robert Gable went first, presenting his case for the conservatorship. He painted a picture straight from their petition of a once vibrant mother, now confused and isolated, being manipulated by a husband who was draining their resources. He used words like vulnerable, exploited, and alarming financial decisions. He presented the fact that we'd consulted a lawyer and created a trust as evidence of this undue influence and paranoia. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She stood, calm and poised. Your Honor, if I may, the petitioners have presented a compelling work of fiction. The reality is far simpler and far more tragic. This is a case of adult children attempting to use the legal system to commit financial elder abuse after their parents refused to hand over their home. She then called me to the stand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked to the witness box and was sworn in. Eleanor guided me through our story with gentle precision. I spoke of the dinner, the ledger, the confrontation. I described the pain of discovering my son's cold-blooded strategy. My voice shook at times, but I kept my eyes on Eleanor, on Paul, on the truth. Then, it was Robert Gable's turn for cross-examination. He approached the stand with a smug, condescending smile. "Mrs. Sterling," he began, his voice oozing false sympathy. "Isn't it true that you've become increasingly forgetful in recent years? Misplacing keys, forgetting appointments?" "No, that is not true," I said, my voice clear. "Isn't it true that your husband has always handled the family finances, and you've simply gone along with his decisions?" "That is not true," I said, feeling a spark of anger. I quashed it. "I have run my own small bookkeeping business for 15 years. I am entirely capable of managing numbers." He tried to trip me up, asking me to recall specific dates and figures from years ago. I answered as best I could, refusing to be flustered. He then moved on to our decision to create a new will. "So, you disinherited your only 2 children," he said, his tone implying I had committed a monstrous act. "Your flesh and blood. After they spent their lives loving you. Doesn't that strike you as cruel, as the action of someone who is not thinking clearly?" I looked past him, directly at Michael and Chloe. They were staring at the table, refusing to meet my gaze. "What I find cruel," I said, my voice gaining strength, "is a son who plots to have his mother declared incompetent because she wouldn't give him her house. What I find cruel is children who use love as a weapon." Changing our will was an act of self-preservation, not cruelty. We are protecting ourselves from our predators. There was a gasp in the courtroom. Gable's face flushed. "Objection." "Non-responsive." "Overruled," Judge Moreno said, her eyes on me. "The witness may continue." "I have nothing more to add on that subject," I said calmly. Paul was called next. He was magnificent, solid, steady, and quietly furious. When Gable tried to paint him as a manipulator, Paul looked the lawyer dead in the eye and said, "I have loved my wife for 35 years. I have never, ever made a decision for her. We have always been partners. What you're suggesting is an insult to her, and to me." Then, Eleanor called her surprise witness, Auntie Clara. She walked to the stand, back straight, her expression one of supreme contempt for the entire proceeding. Eleanor had her confirm our long history, our soundness of mind, our close relationship. Then Eleanor asked, "Miss Jones, in your opinion, what is the motivation behind this petition?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Greed," she said, the word cracking through the room like a whip. "Plain and simple. They wanted the house. Ruth and Paul said no. So they've thrown a legal tantrum to try and take it anyway. It's the most disgraceful thing I've ever witnessed." Finally, it was the petitioner's turn. Robert Gable called Michael to the stand. Under his own lawyer's gentle questioning, Michael was the picture of a heartbroken son. He spoke of his love for us, his concern, his helplessness as he watched us make irrational decisions. He was smooth, rehearsed. Then Eleanor stood for cross-examination. She approached the stand slowly, a predator circling its prey. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice deceptively soft. "You claim your mother is financially incompetent. Yet, she has successfully run her own business for 15 years. How do you reconcile that?" "It's a very small business," Michael said, dismissively. "It doesn't require sophisticated financial acumen." "I see. And your mother part-time unsophisticated business income, combined with your father's pension, comfortably covers their expenses. Does it not?" "For now," Michael said. But they aren't planning for the future. The future you outlined in this, correct? Eleanor held up a copy of the ledger I had found. We had recreated it from memory, with Eleanor's help, and had it entered as evidence. Michael's face went pale. He hadn't known we had it. Is this your handwriting, Mr. Sterling? Eleanor asked, her voice like ice. He was forced to admit it was. Eleanor took him through it, line by line. The leverage of our fears. The note about Chloe's business needing a capital injection. The plan to isolate me. And finally, the most damning line. Final option. If cooperation is not achieved, legal avenues may be necessary. Establish grounds for incompetence. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Moreno's face was stony. So, Mr. Sterling, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with contempt. When cooperation, which meant signing over your parents' home, was not achieved, you decided to pursue legal avenues and establish grounds for incompetence. Is that a fair summary? Michael squirmed in his seat, his confident facade completely shattered. It was just a brainstorming document. You never meant for your mother to find it? Eleanor finished for him. No, I'm quite sure you didn't. She had destroyed him. When Chloe was called, she was a nervous wreck, her testimony a mess of tears and contradictions. She claimed she was just going along with Michael, that she didn't understand the legalities. She tried to play the victim, but next to the cold, hard evidence of the ledger, her performance fell flat. After the final arguments, Judge Moreno called for a brief recess before delivering her ruling. The 15 minutes we spent in that little conference room felt like an eternity. Paul held my hand, his grip tight. Eleanor was calm, confident. When we returned, the judge didn't mince words. This court has heard a great deal of testimony today, she began, her gaze sweeping over the room and settling with disapproval on Michael and Chloe. But much of it was irrelevant in the face of one central piece of evidence. The document referred to as the ledger. It reveals a calculated, cold-hearted campaign of coercion and intimidation by the petitioners against their parents. The attempt to frame this campaign as an act of filial concern is not only unconvincing, it is offensive. She looked directly at Michael and Chloe. The petition for a conservatorship is denied. Emphatically. Furthermore, I find the filing to be frivolous and brought in bad faith. The court sanctions the petitioners for the full legal costs incurred by the respondents in defending this action. She slammed her gavel down. Case dismissed. It was over, we had won. The fortress had held. There was no triumph in the victory, only a vast, hollow exhaustion. As we gathered our things, I saw Michael and Chloe hurrying out of the courtroom, not looking back, their lawyer trailing behind them, looking defeated. We walked out of the courthouse into the weak winter sunlight. The world looked the same, but everything was different. We were free. We were safe. The legal battle was over. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, the weight of the victory felt heavier than the fear of the fight had ever been. We had proven our competence. We had defended our home. And in doing so, we had legally, publicly, and permanently severed the tie that bound us to our children. The crucible of the courtroom had not purified our family. It had incinerated it, leaving nothing behind but ashes and the cold, hard diamond of the truth. Victory in court felt less like a celebration and more like surviving a catastrophic illness. There's the relief, the profound gratitude for being alive. But your body is weak, your spirit is battered, and you're left with the daunting task of rebuilding a life around the gaping hole the illness has left behind. The first few days after the hearing, Paul and I moved through the house like ghosts. The oppressive weight of the impending battle was gone, but it had been replaced by a vast, echoing silence. We had won our freedom, but the cost had been our family, and the currency was a pain so deep it had no sound. The sanctions awarded by Judge Moreno meant that Michael and Chloe were legally required to pay our legal fees. Eleanor handled the correspondence, her letters, as sharp and uncompromising as her court presence. A check arrived a month later, drawn on a joint account held by Michael and his wife. There was no note. Cashing it felt like accepting blood money, but Eleanor was pragmatic. "It's not payment," she said. "It's restitution. It's the court acknowledging the wrong they did you. Take it." We did. We used it to pay off the last of our own legal bills, and put the remainder into the trust, a small, bitter monument to the war we had fought and won. The winter deepened, and the world outside our windows became a study in gray and white. It mirrored the landscape of our hearts. We had successfully defended our castle, but the kingdom was empty. I would catch Paul standing at the living room window, staring out at the bird feeder, his shoulders slumped in a way they never had been before. The fight had gone out of him, and what was left was a deep, weary sorrow. I understood. My own grief was a physical presence, a heavy cloak I wore every day. I'd find myself in the grocery store, absently reaching for the peanut butter Michael liked or the specific brand of yogurt Chloe preferred, only to put it back on the shelf, my hand trembling. The phantom limb was gone, but the nerve endings were still raw, screaming that something vital was missing. It was during this time, in the deep freeze of February, that I truly understood the meaning of ashes. Our old life, the one built on the foundation of family, had been burned to the ground. All that was left was fine, gray powder, and you cannot build with ashes. One particularly bleak afternoon, I found myself in the basement, looking for an old photo album, some tangible proof that the happiness I remembered had actually existed. I didn't find the album. Instead, tucked behind a box of old Christmas decorations, I found my old pottery wheel. I pulled it out, dust swirling in the dim light. It was a kick wheel, heavy and solid, a relic from a life before children, before responsibility. In my 20s, I had loved it. I'd loved the feel of the cool, wet clay spinning under my hands, the mindless, meditative focus it required, the magic of transforming a shapeless lump into something beautiful and useful. I had given it up when Michael was born. There simply wasn't time or space for such a messy, time-consuming hobby. I stood there, looking at this artifact from the woman I used to be. Ruth the potter. Not Ruth the mother. Not Ruth the bookkeeper. Not Ruth the defendant. Just Ruth who created things with her hands. On an impulse, I dragged it upstairs, its weight a satisfying strain on my muscles. I cleared a space in the garage, next to Paul's workbench. I bought a bag of clay from an art supply store, the heft of it familiar and comforting in my arms. The first time I sat down at the wheel, my hands were clumsy and unsure. The clay was recalcitrant, wobbling and collapsing. It was frustrating. It was messy. It was perfect. For those hours at the wheel, I wasn't thinking about Michael or Chloe or courtrooms or ledgers. I was only thinking about centering the clay, about the pressure of my hands, about the rhythm of the wheel. It was a complete absorption that was the exact opposite of the fractured, anxious state I had been living in. I became obsessed. I threw pot after pot, most of them lopsided and useless. But I didn't care. The process was the point. It was my anchor. In a world that had become unmoored, the steady, spinning wheel and the primal, physical act of creation held me fast. Paul watched me, at first with bemusement, then with a dawning curiosity. One evening, he came out to the garage and just stood, watching me try to pull a wall up on a particularly stubborn lump of clay. "It's harder than it looks," I grunted, my hands and forearms splattered with gray slip. "Can I try?" he asked, his voice tentative. I was so surprised I almost lost the piece. Paul was a man of wood and engines, of concrete, things with clear functions. This was different. This was art, or at least my clumsy attempt at it. I wiped my hands and gestured for him to sit. I showed him how to wedge the clay, how to throw it down hard on the wheel head to stick it, how to center it. His big, capable hands, so sure with a wrench, were awkward and too strong. He kept tearing through the clay. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that I hadn't heard in months. "I'm terrible at this." "Everyone is at first," I said, smiling. He tried again and again. He didn't get frustrated. He treated it like a new mechanical problem to be solved. And slowly, under his patient, determined hands, the clay began to obey. He couldn't make a vase or a bowl, but he managed to create a small, thick, lopsided ashtray. He held it up, beaming with a child's pride. "Look at that," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I made a thing." It was the most beautiful, useless ashtray I had ever seen. That was the turning point. The pottery wheel became our shared anchor. We'd spend evenings out in the garage, the space heater humming, the radio playing softly, each of us lost in our own spinning world of clay. We didn't talk much, but the silence was no longer empty. It was companionable. It was creative. We were making a mess, and we were making something new, together. I started to see the parallels. The clay had to be centered before you could build it up. If it was off-center, even a little, the whole piece would wobble and collapse. Our lives had been violently knocked off-center. The lawsuit, the betrayal, it had been a massive, destabilizing force. This, the wheel, the focus, the slow, patient building from a solid base, this was how we were recentering ourselves. We weren't just making pots, we were remaking our lives. One lump of clay, one quiet evening, one shared laugh at a lopsided ashtray at a time. The ashes of our old life were still there. I didn't try to sweep them away. I learned to let them lie. But I was no longer sitting in them, mourning. I was using them to mix my clay, to add texture and grit to the new things I was building. The pain was becoming part of the foundation, not the entire structure. Spring began to tease the edges of winter. One day, I looked at the collection of our clumsy, handmade pots lining a shelf in the garage. There were cracked bowls, wobbly mugs, and Paul's collection of comically thick ashtrays. They were imperfect. They were flawed. But they were ours. We had made them with our own hands. From nothing. I looked at Paul, his face smudged with clay, completely absorbed in trying to shape a lid for a jar that would probably never fit, and I felt it a fragile, but genuine, sense of peace. The fortress had held, but it had been a place of siege. This garage, with its spinning wheel and its messy, creative joy, was becoming a home. The anchor had held, and we were finally, slowly, stopping our drift. Spring arrived not with a fanfare, but with a slow, gentle insistence. The skeletal trees in our backyard began to sport a faint green haze, and the first brave crocuses pushed through the cold earth. The change in the season mirrored the subtle shift happening within the walls of our home. The heavy, grieving silence was being gradually displaced by the quiet, focused sounds of creation from the garage, and by a new, intentional rhythm to our days. The pottery had been the first thread. Now, I began to consciously weave others, building a new tapestry of a life, not to replace the old one, but to exist alongside its memory. A mosaic, I decided, was a better metaphor than a tapestry. A mosaic uses broken pieces, tiles, glass, stones, and arranges them into a new, beautiful whole. My life was full of broken pieces. The trick was to stop seeing them as shards of something destroyed, and start seeing them as raw material for something new. It started with my bookkeeping. For years it had been a job, a practical necessity. But now, sitting at my kitchen table with my clients' ledgers, I began to see it differently. I wasn't just balancing books, I was helping small, passionate businesses, the bakery, a local florist, a young woman who started a dog grooming service, stay afloat. I was using my skill to be a small, silent partner in other people's dreams. There was a quiet dignity in that, a connection to my community that I had been too blind to see before. I decided to expand this thread. I volunteered to help with the finances for the local community garden, a sprawling, vibrant patch of land where people grew their own vegetables and flowers. I'd go there on Tuesday afternoons, spreadsheet in hand, and meet with the coordinator, a vibrant woman named Lena who was about my age and had laugh lines etched deeply around her eyes. One Tuesday, after we'd finished going over the seed budget, Lena looked at me and said, "You know, Ruth, you're always looking at the numbers. Have you ever just looked at the dirt?" She led me to an empty plot. "This one's yours, if you want it." I was taken aback. "I don't know the first thing about gardening." "Neither did I," she laughed. "The dirt teaches you. Here." She handed me a trowel and a packet of zucchini seeds. "Just dig. It's hard to be sad with your hands in the earth." It was messy, awkward work. But as I knelt there, the sun warm on my back, my fingers sinking into the rich, dark soil, I felt another anchor drop. This was another kind of creation, slower than pottery, but just as profound. You put a tiny, lifeless-looking seed into the ground, you tended to it, you had faith, and with time and sun and water, it would burst into life. It was a quiet rebellion against the death my children had tried to sow in my life. Paul found his own threads. He started going to a weekly woodworking class at the community center. He came home smelling of sawdust and possibility, his eyes bright as he showed me a slightly uneven but lovingly crafted birdhouse. He'd hang it in the backyard, and we'd watch the sparrows investigate their new real estate. We were building a mosaic of activities, yes, but more importantly, we were building a mosaic of relationships. We started having Friendship Fridays. It wasn't a formal thing, just an understanding that on Fridays, we didn't eat alone. Sometimes it was just my aunts, Grace and Clara, their bickering and wisdom filling the kitchen with a familiar, comforting noise. Sometimes we'd invite Lena from the garden or Bill, a retired teacher from Paul's woodworking class, and his wife. Our table, which had been a place of such painful confrontation, became a place of laughter and easy conversation. We talked about politics, about books, about the absurdity of getting older. We shared meals that were simple but made with care. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the simple, profound pleasure of companionship. One Friday evening, as we were finishing a pot of chili, Auntie Clara looked around the table at our small, assembled group and then at me. "You've done it, you know," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Done what?" I asked. "Built yourself a new family," she said. "A chosen family. It's often stronger than the one you're born into because you pick the pieces yourself." Her words settled deep inside me. She was right. This patchwork quilt of friends and interests wasn't a poor substitute for what we had lost. It was something entirely different, and in its own way richer. It was based not on obligation or blood, but on mutual respect, shared interests, and chosen affection. The most surprising thread came from an unexpected place, the internet. One night, feeling a little lonely, I stumbled upon an online forum for people who had experienced family estrangement. I'd always been wary of such things, imagining them to be pits of self-pity, but this was different. It was a space of stunning honesty and hard-won wisdom. There were stories from mothers like me, from fathers, from children who had cut ties with toxic parents. The details were different, but the core pain was the same. I created a username, PotterRuth, and tentatively typed out my story. Not all of it, but the essence, the betrayal, the lawsuit, the profound loss. The response was overwhelming, not in its volume, but in its profound empathy. Strangers from across the country, from across the world, offered words of validation and support. "You are not alone," they wrote. "You did what you had to do to survive. Your worth is not defined by your children's actions." Reading those messages in the quiet of the evening, with Paul dozing in his chair beside me, I felt a final, crucial piece of the mosaic click into place. The realization that our story was not a unique, shameful tragedy. It was a human story. And in sharing it, even anonymously, I was reclaiming my narrative from the one my children had tried to force upon me. My mosaic was not a perfectly smooth, seamless picture. There were still days when the grief would rise up like a tide, triggered by a song on the radio or the sight of a young mother with her toddler at the grocery store. The broken pieces still had sharp edges. but they were now held in place by the strong grout of my new life, the pottery, the garden, my friends, my partnership with Paul, and the quiet solidarity of strangers who understood. I was no longer just Ruth, the mother who had been left. I was Ruth, the potter. Ruth, the gardener. Ruth, the bookkeeper who helped dreams grow. Ruth, the friend. I was a mosaic of all these things, and the picture, while forever altered, was becoming whole again, and in its own way, more interesting, more complex, and more truly me than the simple, single-image portrait of mother had ever been. 3 years. It's a long time and no time at all. In 3 years, the zucchini seeds I'd planted with Lena had become a sprawling, annual tradition, producing more than we could possibly eat, leading to a summer-long ritual of gifting loaves of zucchini bread to neighbors and friends. In 3 years, Paul's birdhouse had weathered to a soft gray and been home to multiple families of chickadees. In 3 years, the lopsided pots in our garage had been joined by pieces that were actually recognizable as vases and mugs, their glazes my own clumsy, joyful experiments. Our mosaic was solid. The sharp edges of the broken pieces had been worn smooth by time and the gentle friction of a good, quiet life. The grief was no longer a gaping wound. It was a scar, tough, visible, but no longer raw to the touch. Paul and I had settled into a rhythm that was so deeply comfortable it felt like a second skin. We had peace. We had joy, of a quieter, more profound variety than we had ever known. We had built a life that was entirely, authentically ours. Which is why, on a rainy afternoon in April, the doorbell felt like an intrusion from a distant, hostile country. I was in the kitchen, up to my elbows in flour, attempting a sourdough recipe Lena had sworn was foolproof. Paul was in the living room, engrossed in a documentary about deep-sea fishing. The doorbell chimed, a sound that usually heralded a package delivery or a visit from one of our chosen family. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to answer it. The woman standing on my porch was a ghost. She was thinner than I remembered, her face etched with a weariness that no amount of expensive skin care could conceal. Her designer clothes were damp from the rain, and she held no umbrella. It was Chloe. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the drumming of the rain on the roof the only sound. She looked so much older, so much smaller. The defiant, sharp-edged woman from the courtroom was gone, replaced by someone who seemed hollowed out. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking, on the single syllable. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My mind was a roaring static of shock, anger, and a treacherous, unwelcome flicker of maternal instinct. Paul must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He came to the door, standing behind me, a solid, protective presence. I felt his hand come to rest on my shoulder. "Chloe," he said, his voice flat, devoid of welcome. Can I please come in?" she asked, her eyes pleading. "Just for a minute. I need to talk to you." I looked at Paul. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were asking me the question. This was my call. This was my scar. I thought of the ledger. I thought of the courtroom. I thought of the 3 years of silence, and then I thought of the mosaic I had so carefully built, piece by fragile piece. Was I willing to let a ghost from the past shatter it? But she was also my daughter, the little girl who used to have tea parties with her stuffed animals. The ghost of that girl was standing on my porch, drenched and desperate. I stepped back. 5 minutes, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. She scurried inside, dripping onto the welcome mat. She looked around the living room, her eyes taking in the familiar space, now decorated with my pottery and Paul's woodworking. It was the same, but fundamentally different. We were different. We didn't sit. We stood in a tense triangle in the hallway. "Well?" Paul said, his arms crossed. Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "I'm sorry," she began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the house, the lawyer, The horrible things we said. All of it. It was wrong. It was so wrong. The apology hung in the air. It was what I had ached to hear for years, but now that it was here, it felt small. Inadequate. A single sentence could not bridge the canyon they had blasted between us. "Why now, Chloe?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Why, after 3 years of silence, are you here now?" She looked down at her wet shoes, her shoulders slumping. "It's Michael," she said, her voice barely audible. "It all fell apart. His business. It wasn't what he said it was. There were investors. Bad deals. He leveraged everything, including his own house. He lost it all. Everything." A part of me, the vengeful part that Clara had once validated, felt a dark thrill. Karma. The cold, calculating strategist had been hoisted by his own petard. "His wife left him," Chloe continued, a tear finally tracing a path through her makeup. "Took the kids and moved back to her parents. He's a mess. He's not the person I thought he was. He lied to me too. He told me you were spending recklessly, that Dad was losing his mind. I was so stupid. I believed him. I was so focused on my own career, on keeping up, that I let him. I let him turn me into that person." She was sobbing now, genuine, ragged sobs that shook her thin frame. "I lost my brother, I lost my way, and I lost you. I have nothing left, Mom. I have no one." The raw pain in her voice was undeniable. This wasn't a performance, this was a collapse. Paul was unmoved. "And you think coming here, telling us this fixes anything? You think an apology undoes what you did? You tried to have your mother declared insane, Chloe. You stood in a courtroom and lied about her." She flinched as if he'd struck her. I know, Dad. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I see it all now. The greed, the manipulation, it consumed him, and I let it consume me too. I am so ashamed." She looked at me then, her eyes those of the lost little girl. "You built a new life," she said, gesturing weakly at a lopsided vase on the mantel. "I can see that. It's good. You look at peace. I'm glad." She turned to go, fumbling for the doorknob. "I'll go, I needed to say it." "Chloe," I said. She stopped, her back to me, her shoulders tense. My heart was a battlefield. The mother warred with the woman who had survived. The ghost of the past fought with the architect of the present. "Thank you for the apology," I said, choosing my words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. I hear you. It was all I could give. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation back in. It was simply an acknowledgement that her words had landed. She nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and then she was gone, disappearing back into the rain from which she came. I closed the door and leaned against it, my legs weak. Paul was there in an instant, his arms around me. "You all right?" he murmured into my hair. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The ghost had visited, and she had left the scent of rain and regret in her wake. The carefully arranged pieces of my mosaic felt unsettled, rattled. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It's a lot." We didn't talk about it much that night. We ate a quiet dinner, the sourdough a dense, disappointing brick. The uninvited ghost was a third presence at our table. Later, as we got ready for bed, Paul said, "You know, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to let her back in. The door is ours to keep closed." "I know," I said. And I did. That was the core of the new life I had built, agency. The power to say yes, and the power to say no. The ghost of Chloe's visit lingered for days. It stirred up old memories, old pains. But as the days turned into a week, something surprising happened. The mosaic held. The pottery wheel still centered me. The garden still demanded my attention. The Friday dinners with our friends still filled the house with laughter. Chloe's apology and her story of Michael's downfall were like a sudden, violent storm. But my life was no longer a fragile structure that could be blown over. It was a mosaic, cemented in place, its pattern complex and strong enough to withstand the weather. I hadn't forgiven her. I wasn't sure I ever could, not fully. But her visit had served a purpose. It had shown me the karmic justice I hadn't needed to enact myself, and it had given me the one thing I had been denied for so long, the truth, the admission of their wrongs. It was a piece of the puzzle I hadn't known was missing. I could now look at the scar of my loss and understand its full shape. The uninvited ghosts had come, and they had found not a ruin to haunt, but a well-lit, sturdy home. They could rattle the windows, but they could no longer get inside. There is a peace that comes not from the absence of storms, but from knowing you can withstand them. Chloe's visit was the last great squall, a tempest of regret and karmic reckoning that blew in from a past I had worked so hard to make peace with. In its wake, the air felt clearer, the landscape of my life more sharply defined. The apology had been given. The truth had been spoken. There was nothing left to wait for, no other shoe to drop. The story, at long last, felt complete. It's a strange thing, to reach the end of a story you never wanted to be in. You look back at the person you were at the beginning, the woman wiping counters, her heart full of sentimental meatloaf memories, and she feels like a character from a book you once read. A well-loved book, yes, but one you've now closed and placed back on the shelf. Today I am 57, Paul is 62. Our hair is more gray than not, and the lines on our faces are a map of all we've endured and overcome. But there is a light in our eyes that wasn't there before. A light born not of innocence, but of hard-won resilience. I am sitting on our back porch, the one Paul rebuilt with his own hands last summer. It's a perfect September morning. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the last of the summer roses from my garden. In my hands, I hold a cup of tea and a lump of cool, wet clay. I'm not throwing today, I'm just wedging it, working the air bubbles out, feeling its cool, pliable life force under my palms. It's a meditative act. This, I have learned, is the heart of it all, not the pottery itself, but the centering. The process of taking something raw and unformed and making it solid, balanced, ready to be shaped into something new. If you had told me 5 years ago that I would find my deepest wisdom not in my role as a mother, but in a lump of clay and a patch of dirt, I would have thought you were mad. But life has a way of teaching you in the language you most need to hear. So, if you're listening to this, if you're hearing my story and seeing a reflection of your own pain, your own betrayal, your own shattered family, then let me, as your Auntie Ruth, share with you the lessons etched into my soul. This is the wisdom of the wound. First, your worth is not a transaction. For so long, I measured my value by my usefulness to my children. Was I a good mother? Did I provide enough? Did I love them correctly? Their rejection felt like a final, failing grade on my entire life's work. But I was looking at it backwards. A mother's love is a gift, given freely. It is not a loan to be repaid with loyalty, nor an investment to yield a return. Your worth is inherent. It is yours, and it cannot be diminished by anyone's inability to see it, not even your own children's. Second, no, is a complete sentence. We are taught, especially as women and mothers, to be accommodating, to be gentle, to explain ourselves. But there are times when explanation is just an invitation for negotiation. When your core self, your safety, your dignity is on the line, no is all you need. You do not owe your predators a reason why you won't lie down and be their meal. I said no to my children. It was the hardest and most important word I have ever spoken. It was the word that saved me. Third, you must build your own anchors. In the terrible, free-falling silence after they left, I was untethered. The anchors of my old life, mother, family, future, were gone. I had to consciously, deliberately cast new ones. For me, it was the pottery wheel. For Paul, it was woodworking. For you, it might be painting, or hiking, or volunteering, or learning a new language. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that it is yours. It is something that roots you in the present moment, in your own capability, in a joy that is not dependent on anyone else. Fourth, family is a verb, not a noun. Blood relation is a circumstance of birth. Family is a choice you make every day. It is the action of showing up, of respecting boundaries, of offering support without strings. The beautiful, chosen family Paul and I have built with our friends, with my aunts, with our community, this is not a consolation prize. It is the real thing. It is love, active and intentional. Do not be afraid to build your own table and invite people who value a seat at it. And finally, the wound leaves a scar, but the scar becomes your strength. The pain of what my children did will never fully disappear. I don't want it to. To forget the pain would be to forget the lesson. That scar is a reminder that I survived. It is a testament to my resilience. It has given me a depth of compassion for others' suffering that I never possessed before, and a bullshit detector for toxic people that is second to none. The wound broke me open, but in doing so, it made room for a wiser, truer, more authentic me to emerge. I look out at my garden. The zucchini plants are spent now, their large leaves yellowing and collapsing. But in their place, the late-blooming asters are a riot of purple, and the sedum is turning a beautiful, rusty red. There is a season for everything. A season for growth, a season for harvest, and a season for rest and regeneration. Paul comes out onto the porch, 2 mugs of fresh coffee in his hands. He sets one down beside me and sits in the Adirondack chair he built, its wood already silvery from the sun and rain. He doesn't speak, he just sits, sipping his coffee, watching the birds at the feeder, the one that replaced his first, lopsided attempt. We have not heard from Chloe again. Her storm passed, and the silence that returned was different. It was a silence we chose, a boundary we maintained from a place of strength, not hurt. We hope she finds her way, we truly do. But her path is no longer our responsibility to clear. My story is not a tragedy. It is a transformation. They left me, yes, but in leaving, they forced me to find myself. And what I found was a woman I rather like. A woman who is strong, who is creative, who is loved, and who is finally, utterly, and completely her own. The clay in my hands is finally centered. It is a perfect, smooth, symmetrical mound, ready for whatever shape I choose to give it next. And so are you, my dear, so are you. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.